So, good evening. As you know, today is Father's Day, so I would like to start by wishing a happy Father's Day to all the wonderful dads and women who have stepped into the role of a dad and father figures out there, here in this meeting and all around the world. Chestnut Retreat Center organizes book talks quarterly, every 3 months. This is the third one. So tonight we are excited to have Dr. Jon Pahl as a guest speaker. Dr. Pahl is going to talk about his recent book, Fethullah Gulen, A Life of Hizmet, Why a Muslim Scholar in Pennsylvania Matters to the World. The book was published by Blue Dome in 2019. Dr. Pahl has given numerous book talks on this book, but in my knowledge, this is the first book talk in Pennsylvania. This book is important from many aspects. First of all, there are lots of misunderstandings about the religion of Islam. Dr. Pahl's book dispels these misunderstandings and explains the essential Islamic values, practices, and beliefs. Secondly, little is known about Fethullah Gulen in the US, especially the unfortunate event back in Turkey in 2016 has produced lots of speculations and misinformations about him in the media outlets, even before that. In this biographical book, Dr. Pahl gives us an objective and critical analysis of Fethullah Gulen's life and the Hizmet movement inspired by him. As many of you know, Fethullah Gulen lives in Chestnut Retreat Center in Salisbury. Thus, this book talk is also giving all of us here in the Poconos an opportunity to learn more about our neighbor who lives next door on Mount Eaton Road. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Pahl. Dr. Pahl is a historian, author, teacher, public speaker, researcher, business planner, and community activist. He has received his Ph.D. from the University of Chicago Divinity School. Currently, he is a professor at the History of Christianity at United Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia. Dr. Pahl has authored 6 books, numerous articles and columns, and has earned a reputation as a dynamic public speaker. He has spoken audiences from various parts of the world and the nation. He has also appeared on media outlets from the BBC to ABC. He also has 2 researches in progress, a coming religious peace, the second one, brotherhood and sisterhood. Thank you, Dr. Pahl, for being us tonight. It is an honor for us to host you as our guest speaker.
Thank you, Ali, very much. It's an honor for me to be with you and have this opportunity to talk about my book, and even more to talk about the life of Mr. Gulen and the global Hizmet movement or community he has inspired. But it is Father's Day, so I'm going to start with some dad jokes. In other words, some really terrible knock-knock jokes. I trust you all know how these go. These are my 3 go-to jokes. I'm not by nature a very funny person. I'm half German, half Norwegian. People's not known for their great senses of humor, but here we go. So help me out with this. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Tank.
Tank who?
Oh,
Welcome.
oh, God.
I know, isn't that awful? All right, and there's one more. Thank you, Brian, so much for stepping up. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Olive.
Olive who?
I love you too. And that's what's known as a transition. It is love that's at the heart of the teaching and life of Fethullah Gulen and the global Hizmet movement. If you have an opportunity to read his most accessible work in English, a collection of his essays entitled Toward a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance, you will discover there the very first line: love is the most essential element of every being. Love is the most radiant light. Love is the greatest power, able to resist and overcome all else. So today we're going to be talking about love. In my brief overview, I'm going to present to you 6 different kinds of altruism. Altruism from the Latin word alter, which means other. So love of others, 6 different kinds of altruism in the life of Fethullah Gulen and Hizmet. And I'll run over them very quickly by way of an introduction. The first is the altruism of learning. The second is the altruism of non-violence. Third is the altruism of engaged empathy. Fourth is the altruism of hoşgörü. I will translate that Turkish word for you in due course. Usually gets translated as tolerance, but that's not a particularly good translation. So the altruism of hoşgörü. Fifth, the altruism of istişare, or mutual consultation. And finally, the altruism of riza, living for God's pleasure. So 6 different kinds of love manifest as altruism in the life of Fethullah Gulen and the global Hizmet community in 30 minutes. All right, so here we go. The altruism of learning stems from the fact that Mr. Gulen was raised in a tiny village, Korajuk, near the bigger city of Erzurum in northeast Turkey. He was raised by a very devout and learned family. His mother was his first Quran teacher, and his father was an imam. And he learned the Quran at a very young age, memorized and was able to recite it entirely. But learning in the Gulen household was both spiritual and scientific at the same time. And there was also a playfulness to his learning that I want to appreciate, or want you to appreciate, this altruism of attention to the details that designates or indicates good learning. And one of the ways that he learned, if for some of you will know this, others may not, that the Quran is chanted. So there's a musical lilt to it. And that chanting, some people say, gives us the blues and jazz because of the kind of melismatic movement in Quranic chanting and in the call to prayer, if you've heard the azan and others. It's a very interesting dimension of musicality. But I'm going to read to you a passage from the book about this kind of learning, the altruism of learning. It's on pages 45 and 46. Just give you a sense of the biography. It was not only the chanting of Quran that filled the air with music in the Gulen household. Nuriyat, that is Gulen's late sister, just passed away last year, may God's peace be upon her, remembered that her mother did not sing much because she didn't want us to be spoiled. That says something about the value placed on musical beauty in the household. But Nuriyat did recall singing together with Fethullah and his brother Sigbatullah, a song of the foods, this little jingle which Nuriyat sang for me when I visited her in 2015. And we both broke into tears as she sang it. And Fethullah then recited it verbatim when I interviewed him in 2018. This little song taught children the names of various edible items, from bread to tomatoes, in a celebration of abundance. As I heard Nuriyat sing the melody in her aged voice, and as she remembered her singing it with her brothers as a girl, we both began to cry. Fethullah too grew misty when we remembered the song, and his now late sister and late brother together. So learning through multiple media, obviously through the study of Quran and theology, but also through music and beauty. The metaphor that is often used to describe the altruism of learning in the global Hizmet community, as taught by Fethullah Gulen, is to fly with 2 wings. And that means to embrace learning, both spiritual and scientific. One without the other. Science without spirituality can be mechanistic and materialistic. Spirituality without scientific reasoning tends toward fanaticism and ignorance. So the altruism of learning, beyond the dualism of science and religion toward a love of learning in all of its dimensions. Second, the altruism of nonviolence. Throughout Mr. Gulen's life, despite being slandered as a terrorist, he has advocated for nonviolence, not for an absolute pacifism, because people inspired by him have served in the military and in the police and the judiciary and so forth, all in the interest of self-defense and integrity of public service. But the altruism of nonviolence, that is, not hitting back when hit, not speaking harshly when spoken too harshly, has been a consistent theme throughout his life and has been especially apparent in recent years as he has been increasingly under pressure by the Turkish government, again, slandered as a terrorist. So the teaching of nonviolence in Mr. Gulen's life actually goes back to how he taught people to pray. And one of the ways he did this was through a summer camp, a series of summer camps. It was it's customary among Christians, at least, to send young people to summer camps. It was somewhat of an innovation within Turkey. And another passage that describes this teaching of nonviolence is on page 94 and 95 in the book, and I'll just read a little bit more of it to you. This is about that first summer camp in the year 1966, while he was teaching at the Quran school in Izmir. Bottom of the page. Ismail Büyükçelebi was in middle school when Gulen arrived in 1966. He recalled that the first summer camp happened in a forest near Buja, not far from Izmir. Students attended for 4 weeks. One of the benefits, of course, was that as a captive group, young people could be encouraged to pray Salah regularly and more consciously, away from the distractions of city life. Gulen did not want mere rote participation, however, and the summer camp allowed for teaching about prayer as well as its practice. Büyükçelebi explained, this is a quote, he would continue the kind of lessons he gave in Imam school and sohbets, those talks, during the summer. He always talked about praying with intention. A person who takes their ablution, that is the washing before prayer, seriously with care, their salah, carefully and slowly. These obligations are required, but sometimes people hurry through them. But Hoca Efendi, that's a name for Mr. Gulen, honored teacher it means, Hoca Efendi has a subjective salah condition. If you see yourself not doing parts of the salah in depth, with all of the sincerity you have, do it again. If you don't get it right, do it twice or 3 times until you have the prayer from the bottom of your heart, sincerely. So that emphasis on prayer, I describe as the altruism of nonviolence because it is attending to God, ultimately. And when one prays sincerely, the ego has a way of dropping away. And that loss of ego in prayer is, of course, manifest in the bodily motions of Muslims, in the repetition of Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest. And again, in this attention to the detail of prayer, whether it's the ablution or the bodily postures or the specific words of the prayer. And it's fascinating. Neuroscientists have been studying what happens to the brain during prayer, and studying primarily with Buddhist monks who've been praying, but also now starting to do work on prayer. And not surprisingly to anyone who prays regularly, what they're discovering is that during prayer, the cerebral cortex, the frontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for attention and rationality, fires, while the lizard brain, the amygdala, calms. So the fight-flight response drops through prayer, and the capacity for attention, especially attention to others, increases. The altruism of nonviolence beyond spirit and matter through prayer and the other 5 pillars of Islam and other spiritual practices. Third, the altruism of engaged empathy. One of the things that struck me when I first began writing this book, doing the research for the biography, was that Mr. Gulen cried. And he cried regularly while preaching. And then entire groups of people would start crying with him as well. And this struck me as a historian as a very strange situation, as something that had very much to be, I needed to understand. And what I came up with after interviewing a number of people about this and reading everything I could, watching the videos of the sermons, is that Mr. Gulen was crying out of empathy for the suffering of Muslims and for the suffering of the world, the unnecessary suffering that is so significant. As the Buddha taught in the First Noble Truth, life is suffering. But empathy alone does not build a community or grow a movement. And so Hoj Effendi's tears and this deep feeling of identification with the suffering of others then also motivated engagement in practical action. And so this combination of engaged empathy is the third form of altruism that I'd like to lift up for you. And the passage I'd like to read here is on page 159 in the book. And this is talking again about the summer camps and sort of brings together a number of different themes, including our emphasis on the summer camps and the altruism of nonviolence. So it's sort of a summary of where we've been so far. Page 159. The setting in nature for the camps had its rationale too. In his 1910 essay, The Moral Equivalent of War, American philosopher William James suggested that young people would be stronger citizens if they were tested in their youth by encountering the strenuous conditions of the natural world. Youth would learn in nature and through the hard work that living in untamed nature required, acquire key skills that would sublimate their aggressive impulses into cooperation. In the wilderness, young people could discover a beauty that transcended nation, and they could encounter challenges from which they might learn traits like self-forgetfulness and disinterestedness. It is not likely that Fethullah Gulen knew James's essay. I suppose I could have asked him about this when I interviewed him. But his instinct in starting summer camps for secondary schoolers shared similar motives. Nature, Gulen once wrote, is much more than a heap of materiality or an accumulation of objects. Nature has a certain sacredness, for it is an arena in which God's beautiful names are displayed. Just a pause. For Muslims, there are 99 beautiful names of God, and this is what Mr. Gulen is referring to, how nature itself reveals those names. This display, even more, could motivate people to action, even to the, quote, extent of foregoing the passion of life to enable others to live and service to all creation, end quote. The camps thus served the goal of Hizmet. They connected head and heart, learning and loving through collective labor. As stated by Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, an important influence on Mr. Gulen, Gulen went on, there is an understanding of education that sees the illumination of the mind in science and knowledge and the light of the heart in faith and virtue. The camps were little laboratories in scientific living, but the students in them would also study Islam. This combination, which makes the students soar with two wings, there's that metaphor again, as Gulen explains the theory, has many things to offer. It rescues science from materialism, from being a lethal weapon, and it rescues religion from being cut off from intelligence and life, and from being a fanatical institution that builds walls between individuals and nations. The summer camps, like all the Gulen-inspired educational activities, sought to give youth two wings. They brought together nature and nurture, science and cultural formation. They were rites of passage, at least, if not the moral equivalent of war. So the altruism of engaged empathy in the life of Mr. Gulen, his teachings, and in the global Hizmet community. Fourth, the altruism of hoşgörü. That Turkish word that often gets translated as tolerance. It is at the very heart of what the Hizmet community has done all over the globe, starting with the setting up of a variety of foundations in Turkey especially around Istanbul in the 1970s and 80s. And hoşgörü as a term is actually a compound of two words, hoş and guru, which means to see nicely. And so that's tolerance, right? Or that gets translated as tolerance usually. And it's, again, central to the dialogue activities of the global Hizmet community, and has been a part of Mr. Gulen's life throughout his life. But I had the opportunity to hear a wonderful talk by Professor Scott Alexander from Catholic Theological Union in Accra, Ghana, a couple of years ago. We were there for the first time ever that Christians, Muslims, and indigenous practitioners were brought together in the same room for a conversation. It was just absolutely wonderful, focused especially on interreligious peace building. And Scott said, hoşgörü, properly translated in a theological context, means to see another as God sees them. And that means to see them, another, with eyes, above all, of mercy and compassion. As you know, when Muslims gather, and the first line of every surah in Quran, every chapter in the Quran, begins Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. So this altruism of hoşgörü, of seeing others as God sees them, has a way of overcoming the usual dualisms of us versus them that cause divisions and that lead to conflict. Often those divisions into us versus them dualisms are constructed by political leaders. And so by attending to the other with eyes of mercy and compassion, with this altruism of hoşgörü, Mr. Gulen established a remarkable range of initiatives in interreligious dialogue, unprecedented in Turkey prior to that time, bringing together secularists, communists, atheists, Islamists, newspaper writers, baklava bakers. I mean, across the board, people of all, many and all, and no deep faith commitments brought together in dialogue to ask the question, to ask hard questions. So there was a regular gathering called the Avant Platform that was sponsored year after year to bring together people across the usual divisions in Turkish culture in order to see what could be done together. And as a historian, you ask yourself, okay, how did this community grow so rapidly? I mean, to see something start from one individual and a tiny little summer camp outside of Izmir in 1966 to a global movement, right? With schools and think tanks and TV stations and newspapers and publishing houses, individuals in 160 different countries around the globe. I mean, how did this happen? And one of the key reasons, I believe, is this altruism of hoşgörü, this capacity to think beyond the usual dualisms, to overcome some of those taboos, and to recognize, insofar as possible, God in the other, and reach out to them on those terms. And that, to my mind, is both a theological and a sociological explanation of the dramatic historic growth of Hizmet, this service community, first within Turkey and then around the globe. And I'd be happy to speak to, you know, what went wrong in Turkey from 2012 on, basically culminating in the so-called failed coup of July 15th, 2016. But I'd rather talk about the positive aspects of Mr. Gulen's life and the commitments despite the arrests and persecution that are nothing new in his life, but have been there consistently throughout. Fifth, the altruism of istishara, beyond capitalism and socialism. So one of the distinctive features of Hizmet as a global community is this engagement in mutual consultation. Gulen goes so far as to say that for a Muslim, istishara, or mutual consultation, is as important as prayer. So it's as important as one of the 5 pillars of Islam. And this has the capacity of, fostering internal debate, dialogue, discernment about directions, about tasks moving forward, so that people have a stake, and then learn by doing is one of the fascinating aspects. And I'm on page 294 in the book about this altruism of istishara, this capacity to, listen to others' ideas and not claim all the ego space for oneself and so forth. Bottom of page 294. The learning in a consultation could go 2 ways. Gulen did not only, this is bottom of the page, did not only give direction to people's activities through istishara, he could also become aware of a potential new direction through the activities of those with whom he met. Exactly what Gulen meant by consultation, he made clear in a 1994 essay. Istishara was not an option for Muslims, according to Gulen. It was a requirement, and it was as important as prayer. Quote, for the Muslims of today, consultation is a vital attribute and an essential rule, just as it was for the first Muslims. According to the Quran, it is the clearest sign of a believing community and the most important characteristic of a congregation who have given their hearts to Islam. The importance of consultation is mentioned in the Quran to the same degree as salat, prescribed prayers. Given this importance, and another quote, the most intelligent person is the one who most appreciates and respects mutual consultation and deliberation, and who benefits most from the ideas of others. Those who are content with their own ideas and their plans and deeds, or who even insist or force others to accept their ideas, not only miss a very important dynamic, but face disagreement, hostility, and hatred from the people with whom they are associated, end quote. So consultation and istishara as an internal dynamic within the life of Gulen and within the various initiatives that were begun, I've described as the DNA of Mr. Gulen's life and of Hizmet as a community, focused again on getting us beyond this capitalism versus socialism toward social enterprises. That is not generating wealth just for the sake of wealth, for the quarterly profit of shareholders or whatever, but generating wealth in order to solve social problems. Mr. Gulen, following Saeed Nursi, said that there are 3 basic problems facing the world, and these 3 basic problems are the ones that he has dedicated his life through Hizmet to addressing. And the problems are ignorance, solved through education and through the learning. That is at the very heart of Hizmet. Second problem is poverty, solved through wealth generation, not for the sake of generating wealth for an individual, but for the sake of the community and to fuel the educational initiatives. And then finally, third problem, disunity or violence, solved through dialogue, through hoshguru, basically. And so the altruism of istishara, this generating of this consultative, deliberative spirit in the various initiatives moving forward. And then finally, and I'll wrap up here, altruism beyond time and space, living for God's pleasure. Historians often have a hard time understanding the theological motives and backgrounds or catalysts for social movements and communities. It's been a real blind spot, and partly it's because of the dominance of social history recently, focusing on everyday experience and on movements and their practices. But the power of theological articulations and understandings, motivations, and sort of shared values has been underappreciated in recent years, just as intellectual history has somewhat languished compared to social history. And so I'm on page 212. It's a quote from Mr. Gulen here. One can have no greater reward or higher rank than God's being pleased with him or her, which is only attainable by personal resignation to what God has decreed. And here, a quote from the Quran: God has promised the believers, men and women, gardens through which rivers flow, therein to abide, and blessed dwellings in gardens of perpetual bliss. And greater is God's being pleased with them. That indeed is the supreme triumph. As the greatest rank in God's sight, Mr. Gulen goes on, resignation or God's pleasure is a final target that has been sought by the greatest members of humanity, from the glory of creation, that's Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to all the other prophets, saints, and purified scholars who have passed the final test through sincerity, certainty, reliance, surrender, and confidence. They have surmounted many difficulties and obstacles, and wow, is that true in recent years, and bore many unendurable sufferings and torments. And alas, that also has been the case in recent years. So, 6 kinds of altruism in the life of Fethullah Gulen and Hizmet: the altruism of learning, attention to others; the altruism of nonviolence, prayer beyond spirit and matter; the altruism of engaged empathy, Hoj Effendi's tears; the altruism of Hosh Guru, beyond us versus them; the altruism of Istishara, beyond capitalism and socialism; and finally, altruism beyond time and space, living for God's pleasure. So that's a brief overview of one thread running throughout the book that traces Mr. Gulen's life from his birth in this modest little village in a very poor community, Korajuk, outside of Erzurum, through his life as a Quran teacher and preacher, first in Edirne, then in Erzurum, then in Izmir and around the Aegean, and then in Istanbul, and since 1999 in the United States, where people continue to be inspired by his life and teachings, and may God's blessings be upon him and all of you gathered. And I look forward to your questions and our conversations, continuing through our own istishara, mutual consultation or dialogue. Thank you so much for being present, and I look forward to your questions about the book. Thank you much, Ali.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Before we move to Q&A session, I would like to share a quote. There is a quote from a book that was written in Arabic, recently translated into English by Farid El-Ansari. You may know that name. The title of the book is The Return of the Cavaliers, biography of Fethullah Gulen, originally written in Arabic. One line has stricken me. He used to, talking about Fethullah Gulen, Mr. Gulen, he used to see that which is not seen by others and weep. Fethullah's life is a story of tears. His family name is Gulen, which means the laughing one in Turkish language. What an irony of opposites. This is related to the third altruism type. You talked about the engaged empathy. That line kind of reminded me of this.
Yeah, thank you for that observation, Ali. Yeah, I do know that book in its translation into English, of course, and it was very helpful to me in understanding, especially Mr. Gulen's years living on the 5th floor, and in this weird situation where he was in sort of this political theater where he was, the police would show up and he would go down the back steps and zoom off to Erzurum or Izmir or somewhere Yeah, so he was technically on the run and was an outlaw for those 6 years, and yet he was on the 5th floor in this apartment, teaching and meeting with students and consulting with people. And this is a pattern throughout his life and throughout the history of the Hizmet community, that as political pressure seeks to stamp out this practice of Islam, and that's what we're talking about. And we're talking about essentially the expression of religious freedom. As political pressure seeks to stamp it out, the community grows stronger. Over those 6 years when he was on the run, for instance, when he would have to leave the 5th floor, his apartment in Istanbul, he would go to Erzurum and consult with people there. He would go to Edirne, he would consult with people there. So he was going to safe houses all over the country. And through his perseverance, his resilience, was earning the trust of people, and that learning to trust each other is the central social glue that gets things done. Without that, nothing happens. And this is why, again, this notion of altruism, this commitment to altruism, is a way of living out, the greater jihad, that much misunderstood word that is out there. Mr. Gulen does a wonderful job of explaining that, and I'd be happy to speak to that if you would like. But I thought by highlighting the thread of altruism, it would give us a place to start our conversation. So look forward to more questions. Thank you, Ali.
Talking about altruism, the subtitle of the book, A Life of Hizmet, it is really meaningful. I mean, all of the name, A Life of Hizmet, and the subtitle, Why a Question, these are all meaningful titles. I really appreciate the book.
Thank you.
So, you're welcome. So if anybody has question, you can raise your hand and verbally ask the question to Dr. Pahl, or write the question in the chat box. I received a few questions from the participants, but before that, if anybody wants to ask a question, I'm going to unmute that person.
Say Talha.
Here you go, Talha.
Hello, I have a question. Now, I live in North Carolina, and we have a Turkish restaurant here. We have this restaurant for like 3 years, and we have a lot of American friends coming here and asking how we escaped from Turkey. And with the conversation, they asking how we escape, and what is and we are telling them what is Hizmet movement, who is Hoca Efendi, and they are getting know more and more. And me and my friends decided to buy Mr. Pahl's books, and we started to reading it, and it was really impressive because it's really good to see a people know Hoca Efendi really good. And we set a goal, and goal is to buy 99 of Mr. Pahl's books and give those books to our American friends. And because they already know Mr. Gulen, Hizmet movement, and how we escaped, and how is the situation. And I think in a couple months they will finish the books. And if they want to meet with Jon Pahl, can we invite him here? This is the question. I'm sorry about the long.
No, that's a very completely perfect question. And here's the beautiful development. For 3 years, I've been serving as a pastor of a church in Green Bay. I have resigned from that position and will be returning to full-time academic work starting July 1st at the seminary. So I was half-time at the seminary, which means my academic focus is now my primary focus again, which I am delighted by. I mean, I loved serving in the church. And as the pandemic is in our rear view mirror, God, inshallah, and as more and more people get vaccinated, as I have, and I encourage everyone else to as well, I would be delighted by a visit to North Carolina and an opportunity to meet with those people, those 99 people plus who have read at least parts of my book. and be happy to have a conversation with them, take their questions, sign the books for them, etc. That would be just a joy. There was a lot of that happening before the pandemic hit. In fact, March 10th of 2020, I had a ticket to go to Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland to meet with people inspired by Mr. Gulen and friends. And of course, decided at the last minute, that day, March 10th, that I just could not go. And it turned out that was a wise decision. But your general point that because you have fled Turkey, Hizmet is now growing in all kinds of gardens and in exciting ways, that is bringing people together far beyond even the vision of the first generation. I mean, they could not possibly have imagined, I think, the sort of things that are going on, and your story is just one example of them, Talha. So thank you for that, and look forward to meeting you in person, inshallah.
Thank you, Talha. Another question I received was, what was the hardest and easiest part of writing the book?
Well, the most difficult part of writing the book would be the most recent events. So, I'm a historian. I'm used to writing about things that happened decades, centuries ago, and it was really complex to try to track what was really happening in Turkey from about 2012 on, with the various scandals that were underway, from Ergenekon and Sledgehammer, the Mavi Marmara incident, Gezi Park, and then the corruption inquiries. I mean, all of that is prelude to the failed coup, staged coup, some weird mobilization of the military in Turkey on July 15, 2016. So that was the most difficult part of the book, was trying to track a clear narrative through the very disparate and competing accounts in Turkey, and write in a way that told the truth about the corruption inquiries and how they were shut down. And Erdogan, claimed that there was this deep state that was operating, and then the absurd accusation, the big lie, that Gulen was a terrorist. So that was all, both difficult and painful to write, actually, because I realized how many people were really being hurt by this. I mean, what has happened in Turkey is a series of human rights violations that the world simply has not awakened to, or been aware of, or been motivated to respond to effectively. The easiest part of the book was actually sitting down to write it. When I had enough research together, I was fortunate to have some time. This was before I began serving at the church. And I would wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, I get to write some more," and would spend the day writing. And it really went quite rapidly once I began to sit down. And the basic structure of the book is both chronological, in that it traces Mr. Gulen's life from his birth to the present, but then also topical, in that it focuses on the places where he lived and taught, and organizes the book around that, but then also around 5 topics, 5 what I call seeds of peace. So one of the implicit arguments is that Mr. Gulen belongs within the company of other people who have grown peace around the globe, many of whom, of course, faced serious persecution and imprisonment, and even worse, for their efforts to bring peace. And so the 5 seeds of peace are, learning and nonviolence, engaged empathy, dialogue, and then some kind of social enterprise. So those 5 seeds of peace, those 5 topics, organized the book thematically as well as chronologically. And again, once I had that structure in place, it was a joy to write. I mean, I can't say it wrote itself because that's not true. I mean, it was work, but it was really joyful labor. And I hope some of that comes through in the prose too. I tried to write it in a somewhat lively style, but I am finding an academic, and so ideas and complex sentences tend to predominate rather than direct prose. But I hope it's a good read.
It is a good read, easy read for me.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
One question coming from Osman. He's asking about, he's saying the values you mentioned do not have respect nowadays, at least in Turkey, where Gulen was raised. Will be there times that these values regain their worth?
Well, yes, I mean, I believe so. And, I conclude the book with a beautiful vision by Mr. Gulen of, this spring that will come. So, page 358. And I love this passage because it is just so rich with hope, despite, everything that he has gone through. Our old world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. The springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. The world's riches will be distributed more justly according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, color, language, or worldview, and basic human rights and freedoms will be protected. Yeah, and it goes on with, hope for love, a world of love, compassion, mercy, dialogue, acceptance of others, mutual respect. We're living right now, as I interpret things, with a backlash. That is the backlash to the kinds of democratization efforts begun around the globe in the 1960s and carrying through up until about 1979, 1980 or so. And so the emergence of the neoliberal market economics, Milton Friedman and the company, has produced the kind of kleptocratic regimes that we see now that have taken back from people the power that is rightfully of the people and for the people, by the people, rather than against the people. And these authoritarian backlashes, as I see them, are caused by multiple events depending upon the particular context. But certainly, in what we see in Turkey right now, in this weird kind of conjunction of Islamist kleptocracy on the part of Erdogan, I see as one of those examples of backlash, along with what has happened in Hungary, Russia, Brazil, and the United States under Donald Trump. Those values of altruism were not exactly at the forefront of his administration or people who were motivated by him as well.
Thank you for this. Another question is, this is kind of about the place that Mr. Gulen lives. One of the misconceptions that we face here, based on some misinformation out there in the media, and the assumption that he owns Chestnut Retreat Center. So thinking that that place is his own property, some people might think that Mr. Gulen is a billionaire or lives in luxury. It is my understanding from your talk, he lives a humble life, coming from a humble family, devout and humble family. What would you say to the people who think like this?
Yeah, well, discover, learn for yourself. It's not impossible at all to realize. And I've seen where Mr. Gulen lives, and it's a very simple, modest is even maybe an exaggeration. A little study room and a bedroom and bath, and that's it. And that's been throughout the course of his life. He has chosen to live simply, so that others can simply live, and has inspired that spirit in other people. That is this willingness to recognize that being with the oppressed is the same as being with God, Mr. Gulen said. So his choice to be single, his choice to live simply, his choice to encourage others to live simply and to travel and to serve has been at the very heart of his life. And yeah, it's not a compound. I mean, I've heard that language used time and again to describe this retreat center, which is, basically like a YMCA camp. If you want to think about what it's like, that's it. With Turkish architecture instead of log cabins, but that's basically the spirit of it. It's a pretty laid back place, befitting the spirit of peace associated with this great man. And he is a great man. I mean, there's no question about that. History will remember him as such. And, my biography is the first biography, critical biography in English. It is hardly the last word. I did not have the skills and do not claim them to write a definitive biography. I also didn't have access to the kinds of documents that one would need. So this is an attempt to sort of sketch out a map and prepare the way for another student or students to continue the work of understanding this misunderstood and slandered individual.
I do have a few more questions. One question reads, as a researcher of religious peace, what role do you think Mr. Gulen's thoughts and the movement play in world peace?
Well, as I indicated earlier, I think history will recognize Mr. Gulen as a peace builder in the spirit of Gandhi, or the Liberian Nobel Peace Prize winner Lima Bowie. And here's the challenge. Much will depend on what the next generations do, right? Because as things stand now, and this is not my phrase, this is a phrase from Paul Weller, who has 2 new books on Mr. Gulen going to be coming out very soon. I'm quite excited about this. But as things stand now, Mr. Gulen is a wounded exile. He's been deeply hurt personally, and his vision for Turkey, certainly, and not a political vision, but his vision of a robust civil society in Turkey has been just devastated. And so it depends on what happens in the United States, in Canada, in Belgium, France, Sweden, Indonesia, Australia, all of these places now where people inspired by Mr. Gulen have made hijra, have migrated out of necessity, and now have the opportunity to plant Hizmet service and to watch how it grows in new hybrid ways and how it continues to change. So I believe, just on the virtue of his own life and writings and influence, Mr. Gulen, again, will be recognized as a very significant contributor to a more just and peaceful world, again, depending on what we and what the next generation does by way of continuing to carry out Islam. I mean, to practice Islam with this integrity and sincerity that he has exemplified and fostered.
Thank you for that answer. My question is brief. If you use a few words to answer why Gulen matters to the world, what words would you use?
Mr. Gulen is a Muslim peace builder who bridges the sacred and the secular in a way that exemplifies how the world must change as we face together the climate crisis, ongoing violence in the streets and around the world, and the unsettled character of our hearts post-pandemic. So I really believe there's a vision for a more just and peaceful world at the heart of his teachings in life, a vision that is at the depth of Islam and that builds bridges for Christians and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and atheists and the nuns and all of us as human beings to work together. That's maybe more words than a few, but that'll have to do.
Yeah, thank you. It actually summarizes the book. Thank you, Dr. Pahl and everybody for joining us tonight. It was a very informative and beautiful 1 hour with you all. I hope to see you all in a future CRC program or in a different place. I wish you again a happy Father's Day.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. Take
Good
care.
evening.
Bye-bye.
Peace to you all. Bye.